The canvas lay in tatters across the art room floor, months of careful brushstrokes reduced to ribbons of destroyed dreams. But what those bullies didn't know was that Maya Rodriguez's father wasn't just any parent, he was Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez, fresh back from deployment, and he was about to teach Lincoln High School a lesson they'd never forget. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of November 3rd started like any other at Lincoln High School in Riverside, California. Maya Rodriguez arrived at 7:15 a.m., her worn messenger bag carefully protecting the final touches she needed to add to her senior art portfolio submission. At 17, with deep brown eyes that sparkled when she talked about her passion for painting, Maya had spent the last 4 years pouring her heart into art as her escape from a world that often felt too harsh and unforgiving. Maya's family had moved to Riverside when her father deployed to Afghanistan 2 years earlier. Her mother, Isabella, worked double shifts at the local hospital to make ends meet while Carlos was overseas, and Maya had learned early that staying invisible was often the safest strategy. She kept her head down, focused on her grades, and found solace in the art room where colors and canvas offered refuge from the complexities of teenage social politics. Lincoln High was a sprawling campus of 3,200 students, where social hierarchies ran as deep as geological layers. The school served a diverse community, but like many institutions, it had its share of students who wielded their family's local influence like weapons. At the top of this particular food chain sat Derek Morrison, a senior whose father owned the largest construction company in Riverside County. Derek's crew included Jake Peterson, whose mother sat on the school board, and Trevor Walsh, the star quarterback whose family had lived in Riverside for 4 generations. Maya had managed to avoid their attention for most of her high school career. She ate lunch in the art room, spent her free periods in the library, and chose her classes carefully to minimize overlap with the popular crowd. Her strategy had worked perfectly until the day she made the mistake of winning something they thought belonged to them. The Riverside County Young Artists Competition was the most prestigious art contest for high school students in the region. The winner received a $5,000 scholarship and automatic consideration for the California Institute of the Arts. Maya had been working on her submission for 8 months, a massive oil painting she'd titled Coming Home. The piece depicted soldier's silhouette in a doorway, with warm light spilling out behind him while his family waited in the shadows, their faces a mixture of hope, fear, and love. Maya had painted it thinking of her father, channeling every emotion from the past 2 years of his deployment into each brushstroke. She'd worked on it during lunch breaks, after school, and on weekends, often staying in the art room until the janitor gently reminded her it was time to lock up. Her art teacher, Miss Chun, had watched the painting evolve with growing excitement, occasionally stopping by Maya's easel to offer technical advice or simply to admire the raw emotion flowing from the canvas. The painting was deeply personal, but Maya knew it was also the best work she'd ever created. Every technique she'd learned, every hour of practice, every moment of inspiration had culminated in this single piece. When she'd finally set down her brush after adding the last highlight to the soldier's uniform, she'd felt a sense of completion and pride that was entirely new to her. The competition deadline was approaching, and Maya needed just one more session to apply the final protective varnish and sign her name in the bottom corner. She'd planned to arrive early that morning to complete the work before classes began, ensuring her painting would be ready for pickup by the competition officials later that day. Maya pushed open the door to the art room, expecting to find her painting exactly where she'd left it on the drying rack near the windows. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, and for a moment everything seemed perfectly normal. Then she stepped further into the room, and her world shattered. Her painting lay on the floor in pieces. Not damaged, not accidentally knocked over, but deliberately destroyed. Someone had taken a blade to the canvas, cutting it into strips and scattering the pieces across the paint-stained linoleum. 2 years of her life, months of work, her hopes for college, her tribute to her father, all of it reduced to colorful scraps that looked like confetti from her nightmares. Maya dropped to her knees among the ruins, her hands trembling as she tried to piece together fragments of her soldier's face. The careful detail work around his eyes was gone. The subtle shading that had taken her weeks to perfect was scattered across multiple strips. The warm light that had represented hope and homecoming was now just random slashes of yellow and gold paint on disconnected pieces of canvas. She found a strip containing part of her signature and realized with horror that this hadn't been random vandalism. Someone had specifically targeted her work, taking the time to destroy it systematically. The cuts were deliberate, designed not just to damage but to make restoration impossible. This was personal. Maya gathered the pieces with shaking hands, tears blurring her vision as she tried to make sense of what had happened. 8 months of work, gone. Her scholarship opportunity, destroyed. Her tribute to her father's service, desecrated. The painting that was supposed to represent hope and resilience now symbolized cruelty and loss. Miss Chun arrived 20 minutes later to find Maya sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by the fragments of her masterpiece. The teachers' gasp echoed through the room as she took in the destruction, her hand flying to her mouth in shock and horror. "Maya, what happened?" Ms. Chun knelt beside her student, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Maya managed through her tears. "I came in early to finish it, and it was like this." Ms. Chun picked up one of the larger pieces, examining the clean cuts with growing anger. This wasn't an accident. Someone did this deliberately. She looked around the room, noting that no other artwork had been touched. Maya's painting was the only casualty, making the targeting obvious and intentional. Who would do this? Maya asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. Miss Chun's jaw tightened. She'd been teaching at Lincoln High for 15 years and had seen her share of artistic jealousy and teenage cruelty, but nothing quite this vicious. "Maya, has anyone been giving you trouble lately? Anyone who might have known about the competition?" Maya shook her head, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I kept to myself. I always keep to myself." But even as she said it, she remembered the conversation she'd overheard in the hallway 3 days earlier. Derek Morrison had been talking to his girlfriend, Brittany Walsh, about the art competition. His voice had carried that particular tone of entitled assumption that Maya had learned to recognize over the years. "It's basically a guaranteed win," he'd said. "My abstract sculpture series is exactly what college admissions offices want to see: innovative, bold, contemporary. Not like the amateur hour stuff most people submit." Brittany had laughed, her voice sharp with casual cruelty. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Did you see that painting the weird quiet girl has been working on? So melodramatic. Like, we get it. Your dad's in the military. Stop making everything about yourself." Maya had hurried past them, hoping they hadn't noticed her. But Derek's next words had stopped her cold. "Rodriguez, right? The scholarship kid whose mom works at the hospital? Cute that she thinks she has a shot. This competition is about recognizing real artistic vision, not charity cases playing with finger paints." At the time, Maya had tried to dismiss their comments as typical teenage callousness. She'd encountered plenty of casual prejudice about her family's economic situation and her father's military service. But now, staring at the destroyed remains of her painting, those words took on a darker significance. Miss Chun helped Maya collect the pieces, carefully placing them in a large box as if they were precious artifacts rather than ruined dreams. "We need to report this to administration immediately," she said, her voice firm with determination. This is destruction of personal property, and it's clearly targeted harassment. Maya nodded numbly, but part of her already knew how this would play out. Derek Morrison's father was one of the school's major donors. Jake Peterson's mother literally sat on the school board. Trevor Walsh was being recruited by 3 different colleges for football. The administration would make sympathetic noises, promise to investigate, and ultimately decide there wasn't enough evidence to take action against such prominent students. Principal Williams listened to their report with the appropriate expressions of concern and outrage, but Maya could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. He promised a thorough investigation, assured them that security footage would be reviewed, and suggested that Maya might want to consider submitting a different piece to the competition. "The deadline isn't until 5 p.m., he said, clearly trying to be helpful. "Perhaps you have other work that could be submitted instead." Maya almost laughed at the absurdity. 8 months of work couldn't be replaced in 8 hours. The painting she'd destroyed wasn't just her best work. It was her only work suitable for a competition of this caliber. Her other pieces were practice exercises, studies, experiments. Nothing that could remotely compete at the county level. "Principal Williams," Miss Chun said carefully, "Maya's painting was specifically targeted. This wasn't random vandalism. Someone knew exactly which piece would hurt her most and destroyed it accordingly. That suggests this was done by someone familiar with her work and her schedule." Principal Williams nodded gravely. "We'll interview students who have access to the art room and review any available security footage. If we find evidence of wrongdoing, appropriate disciplinary action will be taken." But Maya could hear the subtext clearly. "If we find evidence that won't create political problems for the school, we might consider doing something that won't upset important families." She'd been in the Riverside school system long enough to understand how these situations typically resolved. The rest of the day passed in a haze of sympathy and whispered conversations. Word of the destroyed painting spread quickly through the school's social networks, generating the kind of dramatic buzz that teenagers thrived on. Most students expressed appropriate outrage, but Maya noticed the conspicuous silence from Derek's social circle. They seemed remarkably uninterested in discussing the vandalism, deflecting conversation to other topics whenever someone brought it up. During lunch, Maya sat alone in the library, picking at a sandwich she had no appetite for. She'd called her mother to explain what had happened, and Isabella's anger had been immediate and fierce. "Mia, this is not acceptable. We need to demand justice. Your father didn't serve overseas, so bullies could destroy your dreams." But Maya knew her mother was working a 12-hour shift at the hospital and couldn't take time off to fight battles at school. Isabella Rodriguez had already sacrificed enough for her family, working extra shifts to compensate for Carlos's military salary, managing the household alone during his deployment, and supporting Maya's artistic pursuits despite their tight budget. Maya couldn't ask her to risk her job by making waves with the school administration. As she sat in the library, Maya found herself thinking about her father. Carlos Rodriguez was currently stationed at Fort Campbell, scheduled to return home in 3 weeks for his first leave in 18 months. Maya had planned to surprise him with news of the art competition, maybe even show him the scholarship. Check if she won. She'd imagined his face when he saw the painting. How proud he'd be that his service had inspired something beautiful. Now she'd have to tell him the truth, that his daughter's tribute to his sacrifice had been destroyed by bullies, that she'd been targeted for being different, for being poor, for having the audacity to believe her art was worth something, that the system meant to protect students had failed her just like it failed so many others who didn't have the right last names or family connections. The afternoon brought more disappointment. Principal Williams called Maya to his office to report that the security cameras in the art wing had mysteriously malfunctioned between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. the previous night. No footage was available. No witnesses had come forward. Without evidence, There was nothing the school could do beyond expressing regret for her loss. Maya walked home that afternoon feeling smaller than she had in years. The box containing her painting's remains sat heavy in her arms, a physical reminder of dreams deferred and justice denied. She thought about all the times her father had talked about fighting for what was right, about standing up to bullies, about the importance of courage in the face of adversity. But courage was easier when you had backup, when you wore a uniform, when the system was designed to support you, rather than protect your enemies. Isabella was waiting when Maya got home, her scrubs still wrinkled from her shift, her eyes red with exhaustion and rage. She'd spent her lunch break calling the school, demanding answers, threatening to involve the district administration. But, like Maya, she'd quickly learned that outrage without influence was just noise. "Mia, we're not giving up," Isabella said fiercely, pulling her daughter into a tight hug. "Your father didn't raise us to roll over when bullies attack. We'll find another way." Maya wanted to believe her mother's determination could overcome the reality of their situation. But as she sat in her small bedroom that night, looking at the box of destroyed canvas pieces, she felt the weight of powerlessness settling over her like a heavy blanket. This was how the system worked. The powerful protected their own, and everyone else learned to accept disappointment as the price of admission to their world. She pulled out her phone and started typing a text to her father. She'd been writing to him regularly throughout his deployment, sharing news about school, her art, her hopes for college. But tonight, she struggled to find words that wouldn't sound like defeat. How do you tell someone who's fighting for freedom overseas that freedom doesn't exist in high school hallways? How do you explain that the values he's defending abroad don't apply to teenagers from military families? Maya deleted 3 different drafts before finally settling on something neutral. "Hi Dad, hope you're staying safe. School is school. Miss you lots. Can't wait for you to come home." She hit send before she could reconsider, then buried her face in her pillow and cried for everything that had been lost and everything that would never be. The next morning brought a new humiliation. Someone had created a fake social media account and posted photos of Maya's destroyed painting with captions mocking her artistic ability and her family's financial situation. The posts were shared widely, generating hundreds of cruel comments from students who'd probably never spoken to Maya in person, but were happy to participate in her public destruction. "Guess Daddy's war money couldn't buy talent," read one comment. "Maybe she should stick to finger painting," read another. "Poor people shouldn't pretend to be artists," added a third. Each notification felt like another cut, another piece of her dignity being stripped away. Ms. Chun found Maya crying in the art supply closet during first period, surrounded by brushes and canvases that now seemed to mock her aspirations. The teacher sat down beside her student on the paint-stained floor, not caring about her professional attire. "Maya, I've been teaching for 15 years, and I've never seen artistic vandalism this cruel or calculated," Ms. Chun said quietly. "But I've also never seen talent like yours. One destroyed painting doesn't erase your gift. These bullies targeted your work because they recognized how good it was." "It doesn't matter how good it was," Maya replied, her voice hollow. "It's gone. The competition is gone. The scholarship is gone. And they're never going to face consequences because their families own this town." Ms. Chun was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. "You know, there are other competitions, other opportunities. This wasn't your only chance." But Maya shook her head. "You don't understand. That painting was special. It was about my dad, about everything our family has been through. I can't just recreate that. And even if I could, what's to stop them from destroying the next one, or the one after that? They've made it clear that I don't belong here." The truth of that statement hung in the air between them. Maya had learned the lesson that Derek Morrison and his crew intended to teach. Know your place. Stay in your lane. Don't reach for things that belong to people like us. It was a lesson reinforced by every system, that should have protected her, but chose instead to look the other way. Later that day, Maya found herself walking past the art room during lunch, unable to resist looking at the empty easel where her painting had once stood. The space looked impossibly vacant, as if her months of work had never existed at all. Other students' paintings hung on the walls, safe and untouched, protected by the simple fact that their creators weren't considered threats to the established order. Derek Morrison appeared in the doorway behind her, his presence immediately changing the energy in the room. Maya tensed, preparing for another confrontation, but Derek's expression was almost sympathetic. "Hey, Rodriguez," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of false concern that Maya had learned to recognize. "I heard about your painting. That's really rough." Maya turned to face him, searching his expression for any sign of genuine emotion. "Yeah, it was. You know, these things happen," Derek continued, moving closer. "Art is fragile. Maybe this is a sign that you should focus on more practical pursuits. Your mom works at the hospital, right? Medical field might be a better fit for someone from your background." The casual cruelty of his suggestion hit Maya like a physical blow. He wasn't just dismissing her artistic talent. He was telling her to accept her assigned place in his social hierarchy. Stay where people like you belong. Don't reach for dreams meant for people like us. "I'm good at art," Maya said quietly, surprised by her own voice. Derek's smile sharpened. "Good is relative. The art world is competitive, expensive, exclusive. It's not really built for people who can't afford to take risks. Maybe this is life, telling you to be realistic about your options." Maya felt something shift inside her chest, a spark of the same fire that had driven her father to enlist, that had pushed her mother to work double shifts, that had inspired her to paint her dreams onto canvas despite everyone telling her they were impossible. Derek Morrison thought he'd broken her, but he'd underestimated the Rodriguez family resilience. "You're right," Maya said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "The art world is competitive. But talent doesn't care about bank accounts. And neither does determination." Derek's expression darkened slightly, recognizing that his psychological manipulation hadn't achieved the desired effect. "We'll see about that," he said, his tone dropping its pretense of friendliness. "Some lessons take longer to learn than others." As he walked away, Maya realized that this was far from over. Derek and his crew had successfully destroyed her painting and her immediate opportunities, but they hadn't destroyed her spirit. If anything, their cruelty had crystallized her determination in a way that success might not have. They wanted her to disappear, to give up, to accept that art was a luxury meant for people with trust funds and family connections. But Maya Rodriguez was the daughter of a soldier and a hospital worker. She'd been raised by people who understood that the most important battles were often fought by those who had the most to lose. And for the first time since finding her destroyed painting, Maya felt something other than despair. She felt ready to fight back. That evening, Maya sat at her small desk and wrote a real letter to her father. Not a text message, not a casual update, but a full letter explaining everything that had happened. She told him about the painting, about the months of work, about the scholarship opportunity. She told him about the destruction, about the bullies, about the administration's refusal to help. She told him about feeling powerless and alone in a system designed to protect everyone except people like them. But she also told him about her determination to continue creating, to keep pursuing her dreams despite the obstacles. She told him that his example of service and sacrifice had taught her that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. She told him that she was proud to be his daughter, and that she wouldn't let bullies define her future. As she sealed the letter, Maya felt something she hadn't experienced in days: hope. Not naive optimism, but the hard-earned hope that comes from deciding to keep moving forward despite the pain. Derek Morrison and his crew had won this battle, but Maya Rodriguez was just getting started. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new humiliations, new attempts to break her spirit. But tonight, surrounded by art supplies and dreams that bullies couldn't destroy, Maya began planning her comeback. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that her father would be home soon. Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez didn't know it yet, but Lincoln High School was about to learn what happened when you targeted a soldier's daughter. The war for Maya's future was just beginning. Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez stepped off the military transport at March Air Reserve Base at 0347 hours on a cold November morning. His duffel bag slung over his shoulder and 18 months of deployment finally behind him. The California air felt different from the desert winds of Afghanistan. Cleaner somehow, carrying the scent of home instead of dust and diesel fuel. He'd planned this surprise carefully, coordinating with Isabella to ensure Maya would be at school when he arrived. Wanting to see his daughter's face when she walked through the door to find her father waiting in their small living room. The drive from base to Riverside gave Carlos time to process the strange sensation of being back on American soil. Everything looked smaller than he remembered, more ordinary. The palm trees lining the freeway, the strip malls, the fast food. Signs all seemed like artifacts from another life. For 18 months, his world had been reduced to forward operating bases, patrol routes, and the constant weight of responsibility for his soldiers' lives. Now he had to remember how to be a father, a husband, a civilian temporarily disguised in uniform. Isabella had kept him updated through their weekly video calls, but Carlos sensed there were things she wasn't telling him. Maya's letters had grown shorter over the past month, losing the enthusiasm that usually characterized his daughter's correspondence. When he'd asked Isabella about it during their last call, she deflected with comments about senior year stress and college applications. But Carlos had spent too many years reading between the lines of military briefings to miss the subtle signs that something was wrong at home. He pulled into the driveway of their modest rental house at 0630, noting the small changes that had accumulated during his absence. The front gate needed repair, the lawn showed signs of Isabella's exhaustion, and Maya's bicycle was chained to the porch railing instead of stored properly in the garage. These weren't criticisms, just observations from a man trained to notice. Details. His family had managed beautifully without him, but they'd clearly been operating at capacity for too long. Isabella emerged from the house before he could knock, her hospital scrubs wrinkled from another night shift, her eyes bright with tears she'd been holding back for months. They embraced on the doorstep like teenagers, 18 months of separation compressed into a moment of desperate connection. Carlos felt the tension in his wife's shoulders, the way she clung to him as if afraid he might disappear again. "She doesn't know you're coming home early?" Isabella whispered against his chest. "I thought about telling her, but you said you wanted to surprise her." Carlos pulled back to study his wife's face, noting the exhaustion lines that hadn't been there when he deployed. Isabella had always been strong, but carrying the household alone while working full-time at the hospital had clearly taken its toll. How is she really doing? Your letters mention college applications and art competitions, but something feels different. Isabella's expression darkened, and Carlos immediately shifted into alert mode. In Afghanistan, that particular combination of anger and sadness usually preceded news of casualties or mission failures. His wife led him inside, poured coffee with shaking hands, and began explaining everything Maya hadn't wanted to burden him with during his deployment. The story emerged in painful fragments. The art competition that meant everything to Maya's future. The painting she'd worked on for 8 months, inspired by her father's service and sacrifice. The deliberate destruction that had shattered not just canvas and paint, but dreams and dignity. The wealthy bullies who'd targeted his daughter for having the audacity to compete above her station. The administration that had looked the other way because money trumped justice in their particular corner of America. Carlos listened without interruption, his expression growing harder with each detail. He'd spent 18 months fighting enemies who wore uniforms and carried weapons, but apparently the real battle was happening in his daughter's high school hallway. These weren't insurgents or terrorists, just privileged teenagers who'd learned that cruelty was an acceptable tool for maintaining social hierarchy. But the damage they'd inflicted was just as real as anything he'd encountered overseas. "She's been different since it happened," Isabella continued, her voice breaking slightly. "Quieter. She still draws and paints, but not with the same passion. It's like they killed something inside her, Carlos. Our bright, hopeful daughter has been replaced by someone who's learned that the world is unfair and dreams are dangerous." Carlos had seen that transformation before, in young soldiers who'd experienced their first taste of real combat. The loss of innocence was always painful to witness, but when it happened to children in what should have been safe spaces, it felt like a betrayal of everything he'd sworn to protect. His daughter had been wounded in action while he was halfway around the world, unable to defend her when she needed him most. "Tell me about these boys," Carlos said, his voice carrying the same tone he'd used when interrogating suspected insurgents. "Everything you know about them and their families." Isabella provided a detailed briefing that would have impressed his intelligence officers. Derek Morrison, son of Riverside County's largest construction contractor, a family that had built half the commercial developments in the area. Jake Peterson, whose mother sat on the school board and whose father owned 3 car dealerships. Trevor Walsh, star quarterback from a family that had been prominent in local politics for generations. Together, they represented a concentration of local power that made them functionally untouchable within the traditional systems of high school justice. "The principal promised an investigation," Isabella said bitterly. Security cameras mysteriously malfunctioned. No witnesses came forward. Case closed. They even suggested Maya should consider more practical career paths, since the arts aren't suitable for families like ours. Carlos felt the familiar surge of protective rage that had driven him through multiple combat deployments. But this was different. In Afghanistan, the enemy was clearly defined and the rules of engagement were established. Here, he was dealing with teenagers whose weapons were social manipulation and economic privilege, protected by a system that valued donations over dignity. "Where is she now?" Carlos asked, checking his watch. Maya would be leaving for school soon, still unaware that her father had returned. "She walks to school early every morning to avoid the bus," Isabella explained. "Too many of Derek's friends ride it, and they've made the commute miserable for her. She spends her lunch periods in the library now, hiding from confrontations. It's like watching our confident daughter slowly disappear." Carlos made his decision with the same swift certainty that had kept his soldiers alive in hostile territory. "I'm going to school with her today." Isabella's eyes widened. "Carlos, you can't just storm into Lincoln High in uniform and start making demands. These people have lawyers, connections, political influence. If you create problems, they'll find ways to retaliate against Maya that we can't protect her from." "I'm not planning to storm anywhere," Carlos replied calmly. "I'm planning to observe. Reconnaissance before engagement. I need to see these bullies in action, understand the terrain, assess the opposition. You can't develop an effective strategy without accurate intelligence." Maya appeared in the kitchen 20 minutes later, backpack slung over her shoulder, lost in thought as she grabbed an apple for breakfast. She was halfway to the door before she noticed the military duffel bag by the couch, the combat boots by the entrance, the subtle signs that her father had returned. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on Carlos, sitting at the kitchen table in his desert camouflage uniform. The apple fell from her hand, rolling across the floor as Maya launched herself into her father's arms with the force of 18 months of separation. Carlos held his daughter tight, feeling how much taller she'd grown, how the soft curves of childhood had been replaced by the angular frame of emerging adulthood. But more than physical changes, he sensed the emotional armor she'd developed, The defensive walls that hadn't existed when he deployed. "Dad, you're supposed to be coming home next week," Maya said through tears of joy and relief. Mom said, "Your leave didn't start until the 25th. "Plans changed," Carlos said simply, studying his daughter's face for signs of the damage Isabella had described. Maya looked tired, older, more guarded than the enthusiastic teenager who'd written him letters about art competitions and college dreams. "I wanted to surprise you, and I thought maybe I could walk my daughter to school on my first day back." Maya's expression shifted, joy replaced by something that looked almost like panic. "Dad, you don't need to do that. I mean, I'm 17. I can walk to school by myself. You should rest, spend time with Mom. You just got back from deployment." But Carlos had spent too many years reading his soldiers' faces in high-stress situations to miss the signs of someone trying to protect him from something unpleasant. Maya wasn't embarrassed by her father's presence. She was terrified of exposing him to the reality of her daily existence at Lincoln High School. "Maya," Carlos said gently, "I've been gone for 18 months. Walking my daughter to school on my first day home isn't a chore. It's a privilege I've been looking forward to since I left." Maya glanced desperately at her mother, looking for support, but Isabella just nodded encouragingly. "Your father wants to see your school, meet your teachers. It's important to him." The walk to Lincoln High gave Carlos his first opportunity to observe his daughter's changed behavior patterns. Maya, who had once chattered constantly about her friends, her classes, her artistic projects, now walked in relative silence, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings as if expecting threats. She checked her phone obsessively, monitoring social media feeds that seemed to cause her visible anxiety. "Tell me about your friends," Carlos said as they approached the school campus. "The ones you mention in your letters." Maya's step faltered slightly. "I don't really have a group anymore. Senior year is weird. Everyone's focused on college applications and stuff. It's hard to maintain friendships when people are so competitive." Carlos recognized deflection when he heard it. His daughter was describing the social isolation that often accompanied systematic harassment, but she was presenting it as normal teenage dynamics. She'd learned to normalize her situation, to accept diminished circumstances as the price of survival. Lincoln High School sprawled across 15 acres of prime Riverside real estate, its modern buildings and manicured lawns projecting an image of academic excellence and community prosperity. Carlos noted the expensive cars in the student parking lot, the pristine athletic facilities, the obvious signs of a well-funded institution serving an affluent population. This was the kind of school he'd dreamed of his daughter attending. A place where her intelligence and creativity would be nurtured rather than stifled. But Carlos also noticed subtler details that triggered his tactical awareness. The security. Cameras positioned throughout the campus. The way certain students moved through the hallways with obvious confidence, while others seemed to navigate carefully around invisible barriers. Social hierarchies were as clearly defined here as military rank structures, but without the protections and accountability that kept military systems functional. Maya's tension increased exponentially as they approached the main entrance. Her shoulders hunched defensively, her pace quickened, and she began scanning the crowd of arriving students with the hypervigilance Carlos recognized from soldiers operating in hostile territory. Whatever had happened to his daughter, it had trained her to view her educational environment as a potential combat zone. "Maya Rodriguez." The voice cut through the morning chatter with practiced authority, causing Maya to freeze mid-step like a deer caught in headlights. Carlos turned to see 3 teenage boys approaching with the swagger of young men accustomed to owning every space they entered. The leader was tall, blonde, and carried himself with the casual arrogance that Carlos had observed in privileged civilians who'd never faced real consequences for their actions. Well, the boy continued, his gaze shifting from Maya to Carlos with calculating intelligence. "Looks like Daddy finally came home from playing soldier." Hope you weren't too busy fighting imaginary enemies to notice your daughter's been having some problems here at school. Carlos felt every muscle in his body tense, but 18 years of military discipline kept his expression neutral. This had to be Derek Morrison, the ringleader Isabella had described. The boy's tone carried just enough disrespect to be offensive, without crossing into obvious insubordination, a technique Carlos recognized from manipulative recruits who tested his authority during basic training. "Derek, please," Maya said quietly, her voice carrying a note of desperation that broke Carlos's heart. "Just leave us alone." Derek's smile widened, sensing weakness. "Leave you alone? But Maya, I'm just being friendly. Welcoming your father home, thanking him for his service. Isn't that what we're supposed to do for our brave military families?" The sarcasm in Derek's voice was subtle but unmistakable, designed to sound respectful to casual observers while delivering maximum insult to its intended targets. Carlos had encountered similar psychological tactics from enemy combatants, but hearing them directed at his daughter triggered a level of rage that required significant self-control to contain. "Derek Morrison," Carlos said calmly, extending his hand with deliberate courtesy. "Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez. Maya's mentioned you in her letters." Derek's confidence wavered slightly at the unexpected politeness, but he recovered quickly, gripping Carlos's hand with the unnecessarily firm squeeze that insecure young men often employed to establish dominance. Carlos had dealt with similar behavior from junior officers trying to prove themselves, but he'd also learned that real strength didn't need to advertise itself through juvenile displays. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Derek replied, his tone suggesting he'd researched military customs specifically for this encounter. "Thank you for your service. I hope the Middle East wasn't too challenging for someone from your background." The comment was expertly crafted to sound supportive, while implying that Carlos's ethnic heritage and economic status made him less capable than other soldiers. Derek had clearly inherited his father's skill for wrapped insults and polite language, a talent that probably served him well in social situations where direct confrontation would be inappropriate. "Every deployment has its challenges," Carlos replied evenly. "But American soldiers are trained to overcome obstacles and complete their missions regardless of circumstances. We don't let bullies dictate the terms of engagement." Derek's eyes narrowed slightly, recognizing that the conversation had shifted into territory where he was no longer controlling the narrative. "Bullies, sir, I think there might be some misunderstanding. Maya and I have had some academic competition but nothing inappropriate. Sometimes people misinterpret normal high school dynamics when they're not familiar with how these things work." Carlos had to admire the boy's tactical intelligence. Derek was suggesting that a deployed soldier couldn't understand civilian teenage social structures, while simultaneously dismissing Maya's experiences as misinterpretation rather than systematic harassment. It was a sophisticated deflection technique that probably worked well on adults who wanted to avoid confrontation with influential families. "Maya," Carlos said, turning to his daughter while keeping Derek in his peripheral vision, "why don't you show me to your first class? I'd like to meet your teachers before I head home." Maya nodded eagerly, clearly desperate to escape the confrontation. But Derek wasn't finished establishing his dominance. "Actually, sir, you might want to speak with Principal Williams before visiting classrooms. There are policies about non-faculty adults on campus, especially during instructional time. Security concerns, you understand. We've had some incidents this year that required enhanced protocols." The implication was clear. Derek was suggesting that Carlos represented a potential security threat to the school, that his presence required administrative approval and monitoring. It was another sophisticated insult, wrapped in apparent concern for safety and policy compliance. Carlos smiled, the same expression he'd worn when dealing with hostile foreign officials who'd tried to restrict his soldiers' movements. "That's excellent advice, son. I'll definitely want to discuss security concerns with Principal Williams. Sounds like there have been some significant problems that need addressing." Derek's confident expression flickered again, recognizing that his attempt to establish control had somehow backfired. Carlos had accepted the suggestion while implying that the security concerns might involve Derek himself, turning the boy's own words into potential ammunition. "Well," Derek said, recovering his composure, "I'm sure everything will work out. Maya knows how things operate here. Don't you, Maya?" The threat in that final question was unmistakable, a reminder that Carlos would eventually leave and Maya would still have to navigate Lincoln High's social minefield without protection. Derek was establishing that whatever happened today, his power over Maya's daily existence remained intact. Carlos watched his daughter's reaction to Derek's implicit threat, noting how she seemed to shrink into herself, how her eyes dropped to the ground in automatic submission. This was learned behavior, the result of months of psychological conditioning that had taught her to accept abuse as the price of survival. "Maya knows exactly how things should operate," Carlos said firmly, placing a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder. "And now I do too." Derek's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the calculating predator beneath the polite facade. He'd expected to intimidate a military father with social maneuvering and implied threats, but Carlos had responded with calm authority that couldn't be easily dismissed or discredited. "Enjoy your visit, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Derek said, his tone carrying a note of dismissal. "I'm sure you'll find Lincoln High very educational." As Derek and his crew walked away, Carlos noted how other students gave them a wide berth, how conversations quieted when they passed, how their presence seemed to create ripples of tension throughout the hallway. These boys weren't just bullies. They were domestic terrorists operating in an educational environment, using fear and intimidation to control their civilian population. "Dad," Maya whispered urgently as they walked toward the administrative offices, "please don't make this worse for me. Derek's family has a lot of influence here. If you cause problems, they'll find ways to retaliate that you can't protect me from." Carlos stopped walking and turned to face his daughter, seeing clearly for the first time how deeply the psychological damage had penetrated. Maya had been so thoroughly conditioned to accept abuse that she was now protecting her abusers from consequences, prioritizing their comfort over her own safety and dignity. "Maya," Carlos said gently but firmly, "what you just experienced isn't normal high school social dynamics. It's systematic harassment designed to make you feel powerless and isolated. Those boys have declared war on you, and they're counting on you to surrender without fighting back." Maya's eyes filled with tears of frustration and fear. "But what can we do? Their families own half the businesses in Riverside. Their parents donate money to the school, serve on boards, have connections everywhere. Principal Williams won't do anything that might upset major donors. The police won't get involved in high school drama. There's no system that will help us." Carlos felt his heart break as he recognized his own daughter's voice, speaking the words of someone who'd learned to accept injustice as inevitable. This was what defeat looked like. Not dramatic collapse, but quiet resignation to the idea that some battles couldn't be won. "Baby," Carlos said, using her childhood nickname, "I didn't spend 18 months fighting for democracy overseas just to come home and watch my daughter surrender to terrorists in the hallway of her own school. There are always systems, always options, always ways to fight back when you understand the terrain and choose the right tactics." Maya looked up at her father with a mixture of hope and skepticism, wanting to believe him, but having learned through painful experience that adults often made promises they couldn't keep. "What are you going to do?" Carlos smiled, the expression carrying the confidence of a man who'd successfully completed dozens of high-stakes missions in hostile territory. "First, I'm going to gather intelligence. Then I'm going to develop a strategy. Then I'm going to teach some privileged young men that they're war against. You just became a war against someone who fights back. As they approached Principal Williams's office, Carlos began mentally cataloging everything he'd observed during the morning's reconnaissance mission. Derek Morrison and his crew had made their first tactical error by engaging directly instead of maintaining their previous strategy of operating from the shadows. They'd revealed their methods, their psychological weapons, their assumption that intimidation would work against a military family. But Derek had also revealed something else. He was afraid. Beneath the practiced arrogance and social maneuvering, Carlos had detected the uncertainty of someone whose power depended entirely on his victim's compliance. Derek ruled through fear, because he'd never learned to lead through respect or capability. That was a weakness Carlos could exploit. Principal Williams greeted them with the nervous enthusiasm of an administrator faced with a uniformed parent whose child had been the subject of recent complaints. He was a soft-looking man in his 50s, clearly uncomfortable with conflict and obviously skilled at avoiding decisions that might create political problems for his institution. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Williams said, extending his hand with exaggerated warmth. "What an honor to meet you. Thank you for your service. Maya is such a talented young lady. We're so proud to have her as part of the Lincoln High family." Carlos noted the immediate shift to positive language, the attempt to frame Maya's experience in terms of success and inclusion rather than acknowledging the problems Isabella had described. This was damage control, an attempt to prevent a military parent from escalating complaints that had already proven politically inconvenient. "Principal Williams," Carlos replied, accepting the handshake while maintaining steady eye contact. "I appreciate the opportunity to visit Maya's school on my first day back from deployment. I'm very interested in understanding her educational experience here." Williams's smile became slightly strained as he recognized the implicit challenge in Carlos's polite words. Of course. Maya has been working very hard this year. Senior year is always challenging, but she's maintained excellent grades despite some minor social adjustments that are normal for students from her background." The phrase "students from her background" hung in the air like a warning flare, revealing Williams's assumption that military families should expect different treatment than civilian families with greater social capital. Carlos filed the comment away as evidence of the systemic bias Maya had been facing. "What kind of social adjustments?" Carlos asked with the same tone he'd used when questioning captured insurgents about their operational networks. Williams shifted uncomfortably, clearly regretting his choice of words. "Well, you know how it is with scholarship students. They sometimes need time to adapt to the social dynamics of a school like Lincoln High. Maya has been learning to navigate relationships with students from more established local families." Carlos translated this diplomatic language into clearer terms. Maya had been systematically excluded and harassed because she wasn't wealthy enough to belong to the school's elite social circles. Williams was describing her isolation as a natural adaptation process rather than acknowledging it as the result of deliberate cruelty. "I see," Carlos said calmly. "And how does the school support students during these adaptation processes? What systems are in place to ensure that social dynamics don't interfere with educational opportunities?" Williams's discomfort increased visibly as he realized that Carlos wasn't going to accept vague platitudes about normal social adjustment. "We have counseling services available, of course, and our teachers are trained to maintain inclusive classroom environments. We take any reports of inappropriate behavior very seriously." "Inappropriate behavior," Carlos repeated thoughtfully. "That's an interesting phrase. What would constitute inappropriate behavior in Lincoln High's social environment?" Maya shifted nervously beside him, clearly uncomfortable with her father's interrogation technique, but Carlos needed to understand exactly how the administration defined and addressed the systematic harassment she'd been experiencing. Williams glanced at Maya before answering, his calculation obvious. "Well, we have zero-tolerance policies for physical violence, of course. And we address any documented instances of verbal harassment or cyberbullying. But we also recognize that teenagers can be dramatic about normal social conflicts, so we try to help them develop resilience and perspective. The message was clear: unless Maya's harassment involved actual physical assault or could be definitively proven through documentation, the administration would classify it as normal teenage drama that she needed to handle herself. Williams was explaining why Derek Morrison and his crew had operated with impunity while Maya had been told to develop resilience. "That's a very measured approach," Carlos said, his tone suggesting approval while his words carried subtle criticism. "I'm curious about a specific incident involving Maya's art project. Perhaps you could help me understand how the school's policies applied in that situation." Williams's face went pale as he realized the conversation had moved into territory where his previous damage control efforts had clearly failed. "Ah yes, the destroyed painting. Very unfortunate incident. We conducted a thorough investigation. But unfortunately, we weren't able to identify the perpetrators or gather sufficient evidence for disciplinary action." Carlos nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense. "So the investigation concluded that the destruction was random vandalism rather than targeted harassment." "Well," Williams said carefully, "we couldn't definitively establish a motive or identify suspects. The security system experienced technical difficulties that night, so we had limited investigative tools available." Carlos had spent enough time in military intelligence to recognize when someone was lying through careful omission. Williams wasn't claiming the incident was random. He was claiming they couldn't prove it was targeted, despite obvious evidence that Maya's painting had been specifically selected for destruction. "Technical difficulties," Carlos repeated. "That's unfortunate timing. I assume the security system has been upgraded since then to prevent similar incidents." Williams's silence stretched long enough to answer the question. "No upgrades had been made because the security failure had been convenient rather than accidental, providing plausible deniability for an administration that preferred to avoid confronting influential families." "Principal Williams," Carlos said, his voice taking on the tone he'd used when delivering ultimatums to uncooperative foreign officials, "I want to be very clear about something. My daughter is an American citizen who deserves equal protection and educational opportunity regardless of her family's economic status or military service. If the systems currently in place aren't adequate to ensure her safety and academic success, then those systems need to be modified or replaced." Williams's nervous smile disappeared entirely as he recognized that this wasn't a conversation. He could deflect with diplomatic language and bureaucratic procedures. Carlos Rodriguez wasn't requesting help. He was stating expectations and implying consequences for failure to meet them. "Of course, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. Maya's welfare is our top priority. If you have specific concerns or suggestions for improvement, I'm always open to productive dialogue with involved parents." Carlos smiled, recognizing capitulation when he heard it. Williams had just acknowledged that previous efforts had been inadequate and opened the door for parental intervention in school policies. It was a small victory, but an important one. "I appreciate that, Principal Williams. I think you'll find that military families can be very creative when it comes to solving complex operational challenges. We're trained to adapt our tactics to achieve mission objectives regardless of initial obstacles." As they left the administrative office, Maya looked up at her father with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Dad, what did you just do in there?" Carlos put his arm around his daughter's shoulders, noting how she seemed to stand a little taller when she felt protected and supported. "I established the terms of engagement, baby. Now let's go meet some of your teachers and continue gathering intelligence." The rest of the morning provided Carlos with a comprehensive understanding of his daughter's daily reality at Lincoln High School. He observed how Maya navigated the hallways with practiced invisibility, how certain students seemed to take pleasure in making her uncomfortable, how teachers either ignored the subtle harassment or actively contributed to her isolation. through their own biases about military families and scholarship students. By lunchtime, Carlos had developed a clear operational assessment of the situation. Maya was facing a coordinated campaign of psychological warfare designed to drive her out of school or break her spirit completely. The administration was actively complicit through willful blindness and policy manipulation. The harassment was systematic, escalating, and likely to continue until someone introduced consequences that Derek Morrison and his crew couldn't ignore or deflect. Carlos Rodriguez had fought enemies on 3 different continents, but he'd never encountered opponents who disguised their cruelty as teenage social dynamics, while hiding behind their parents' money and influence. These weren't just bullies. They were domestic enemies of everything he'd sworn to protect and defend. The war for his daughter's future was about to escalate dramatically, and Derek Morrison had no idea what kind of enemy he'd just provoked. Carlos Rodriguez arrived at Lincoln High School the next morning in full dress uniform, his ribbons and decorations gleaming under the fluorescent lights. But he wasn't alone. Behind him walked Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes from the Base Public Affairs Office, Dr. Michael Santos from the district's Title X Compliance Division, and Jennifer Park, a civil rights attorney who specialized in educational discrimination cases. Derek Morrison spotted the entourage from across the cafeteria, and his confident smirk evaporated instantly. This wasn't the isolated military father he'd expected to intimidate into submission. This was a coordinated operation with official backing and legal authority. Principal Williams intercepted them at the main office, his face pale with panic. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, I wasn't expecting such a large delegation. Perhaps we could schedule a more appropriate time for this discussion." "Principal Williams," Lieutenant Colonel Hayes said crisply, "we're here to conduct a federal compliance review regarding harassment of military-connected students. This isn't a scheduled meeting, it's an investigation." Carlos watched with satisfaction as Williams realized that Derek Morrison's harassment campaign had triggered something far beyond local school politics. Federal protection laws for military families carried serious consequences that even wealthy donors couldn't deflect through political connections. Derek appeared in the hallway with his usual crew, but his swagger had been replaced by visible nervousness. He'd researched military customs enough to recognize the significance of Carlos's dress uniform and the authority represented by the other officials. This wasn't high school social maneuvering anymore. "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Santos called out, "we'd like to speak with you and your associates. Now." Derek's face flushed red as every student in the vicinity turned to stare. His carefully constructed image of untouchable popularity crumbled as he was publicly summoned like a common disciplinary case, rather than the social royalty he'd always considered himself. In the principal's office, the evidence Carlos had methodically gathered over the past week painted a devastating picture. Security footage he'd requested through military channels, screenshots of social media harassment, witness statements from students who'd finally found courage to speak up, financial records showing the Morrison family's donations and their correlation with dismissed complaints. This represents a pattern of systematic harassment targeting students from military families, Jennifer Park explained to Principal Williams. Federal law provides specific protections that your administration has failed to implement. Derek tried his usual deflection tactics, but they fell flat against trained investigators who dealt with far more sophisticated attempts at deception. His claims of innocent social dynamics couldn't explain the deliberate destruction of Maya's painting or the coordinated campaign of intimidation that followed. Jake Peterson and Trevor Walsh broke first, admitting their roles in exchange for reduced consequences. Derek's empire of fear collapsed as his lieutenants abandoned him to save themselves. The boy who'd ruled through intimidation discovered that loyalty bought with fear disappeared the moment real consequences appeared. The resolution came swiftly. Derek Morrison was expelled permanently, His college applications flagged with conduct violations that would follow him to every institution. His father's construction company faced federal contract reviews that would cost millions in lost government. Work, the Morrison family's influence, built on money and connections, proved worthless against military documentation and federal oversight. Maya stood in the art room where her painting had been destroyed, but this time she wasn't alone. Students, who'd been silent witnesses to months of harassment, now approached her with apologies and support. The toxic culture Derek had cultivated was being replaced by something healthier. Principal Williams resigned rather than face the federal investigation. The new administration implemented military family liaison programs and zero-tolerance harassment policies with actual enforcement mechanisms. What had seemed like an untouchable system of privilege crumbled when finally challenged by people who understood how to fight institutional corruption. Carlos watched his daughter paint again, her passion restored and her confidence rebuilt. The scholarship opportunities Eureka had tried to steal were replaced with even better options, as colleges competed to recruit a student whose courage had transformed an entire school system. 6 months later, Maya Rodriguez stood at the podium during her high school graduation as valedictorian, her father beaming with pride in the audience. Her acceptance speech focused on the importance of standing up to bullies and the power of families who refused to accept injustice. Derek Morrison watched the ceremony from his new school in another state. His former kingdom nothing but a cautionary tale about what happened when privileged children targeted the wrong family. Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez had completed his most important mission, protecting his daughter's dreams and teaching an entire community that military families would never surrender to domestic terrorists, no matter how much money their parents had. The war was over, and Maya had won. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.